We found the graveyard first, and we mistook it for a victory. That is the thing I have to confess at the start, because it is the mistake that every conqueror before us had made for 15,000 years, and we made it too, exactly as they had, and only one of us lived long enough in understanding to see why the graveyard was not what it looked like, and that one was me, and I am the reason you are hearing the truth instead of the legend. The legend says a human fortress beyond Pluto slaughtered 15,000 years of conquerors and left their wrecks as a warning. The truth is stranger and gentler and far more humbling, and I learned it the only way it could be learned, by being the last conqueror to fail and the first to understand why. Let me tell you what we found, out there in the dark past the last planet, where the light of the sun is only the brightest of the stars, and the cold is the cold of the spaces between. The graveyard was a field of wrecks. Ships, thousands of them, tens of thousands, drifting in a vast slow cloud in the dark beyond Pluto, the hulls of 100 different species and 100 different ages, some so old their metal had gone strange in the long cold, some recent enough that we recognized the make. A graveyard of fleets, and at the center of the graveyard, the thing all those fleets had come for and died around. The fortress. A human structure, ancient beyond reckoning. Our first scans dated it past 15,000 years, built when humanity was young, set out here at the frozen edge of their own system, silent, dark, patient, ringed by the wrecks of everyone who had ever come to take it. We were the Kasari Reach, and we had come, like all the others, to take it. I will not pretend otherwise. We were conquerors, that was our trade, and the fortress beyond Pluto was the great prize of the Reach, the legendary unconquered human stronghold, the thing that had defeated every fleet that ever came for it across 15,000 years. Whatever humanity had locked inside a fortress that ancient, that well-defended, that surrounded by the proof of its own invincibility, it had to be the greatest treasure in the galaxy, a hoard, a weapon, a secret worth the deaths of 15,000 years of conquerors. And we, the Kasari, believed we would be the ones to take it where all others had failed, because every conqueror believes that, because the believing is what makes you a conqueror. We saw the graveyard, and we read it the way every conqueror before us had read it, as a battlefield, as the record of a fortress so deadly that it had destroyed tens of thousands of ships, slaughtered every fleet that came for it, piled up the wrecks of the galaxy's conquerors as trophies of its invincibility. We looked at the field of dead ships, and we felt the thrill of the great challenge. Here was a fortress that had killed everyone who tried, and we would be the ones who finally did not die, who finally broke through, who finally took the prize that 15,000 years of lesser conquerors had died failing to take. The graveyard frightened the weak among us and excited the strong, and either way we all read it the same, as the work of the fortress, the kills of an invincible human weapon, the warning of a stronghold that destroyed all who approached. We were wrong about the graveyard. That is the first thing I learned slowly over the long, terrible weeks of our expedition, and it is the key to everything. The fortress had not killed those ships. The fortress had never killed anything. I examined the wrecks. It was my task as expedition commander to study the failures of those who had come before, to learn from their deaths how to avoid our own, and what I found in the wrecks was not the work of a weapon. The dead ships had not been destroyed. They bore no marks of battle, no scoring of weapons, no breaches of any assault. They had simply stopped, been abandoned, run out. The fleets that came to take the fortress had not been slaughtered by it. They had died around it slowly, of exhaustion, of starvation, of the long futility of besieging a thing that could not be besieged, of turning on each other in the frustration of a conquest that would not come, of waiting and waiting in the cold dark for a fortress to fall that never fell and never fought, and never did anything at all except remain, silent and shut, while the conquerors who came for it wore themselves out and died of their own failure at its unmoving gate. The graveyard was not the fortress's kills. The graveyard was the fortress's patience. 15,000 years of conquerors had come, and the fortress had not fought a single one of them, had simply remained shut, remained silent, remained untakeable. And the conquerors, unable to take it and unwilling to leave the great prize, had lingered at its gate until they died, each fleet adding its wrecks to the slow cloud, the graveyard growing not from battles but from the accumulated failure of 15,000 years of greed that could not let go of a thing it could not have. The fortress had killed no one. The conquerors had killed themselves, on the rock of their own inability to take a thing that yielded nothing to force. And it yielded nothing to force. That was the thing we learned next, the thing that broke our expedition the way it had broken all the others. We assaulted the fortress, of course we did, we were conquerors, force was our answer to everything, and the fortress did not resist us and did not yield to us. Our weapons did not scar it. It was built of something or protected by something that 15,000 years and 10,000 assaults had never marked. But it did not strike back either. It simply did not open. We could not breach it, and it would not break, and it would not fight, and it would not yield. And we stood at its gate with all our force and learned the thing that 15,000 years of conquerors had learned before us. That the fortress beyond Pluto could not be taken by force, not because the force was met by greater force, but because force was simply the wrong tool, as useless against that door as a fist against the cold of space. I have to tell you what the fortress was because I worked it out in the long weeks at its gate, while my expedition began to do what all the expeditions before us had done, to fray, to starve, to turn on itself in the frustration of a conquest that would not come. I worked it out from the wrecks, from the patience, from the door that would not yield to force, and the working out is the heart of the story. The fortress was not a stronghold. It was not a hoard or a weapon or a treasure vault to be cracked. The fortress was a test. Humanity, 15,000 years ago, had built a thing out here at the edge of their system and sealed inside it. I did not yet know what, and they had sealed it with a lock that no conqueror could ever pick, because the lock was not a mechanism but a question, and the question was, did you come to take or did you come in peace? And the door opened only to the second answer. Force could not open it. Greed could not open it. Conquest could not open it. The fortress yielded nothing to anyone who came to take it. And so, for 15,000 years it had remained shut, because for 15,000 years everyone who came had come to take, and the graveyard was the record of all of them. Every conqueror who could not pass a test that conquest itself made impossible to pass, dying at the gate of a door that would have opened in an instant to anyone who came without the wish to seize what lay behind it. That is where this story begins. Aliens found a graveyard beyond Pluto, and a fortress that survived 15,000 years of failed conquerors. And the legend says the fortress slaughtered them all. But the truth is that the fortress never lifted a hand, that it killed no one, that it simply remained shut to force and patient against greed, while 15,000 years of conquerors destroyed themselves at its gate, trying to take by force a thing that could only be received in peace. I will tell you what was inside, and how I came to open it, and what it cost me and what it gave me, because I am the one who finally understood, at the gate where my own expedition was dying around me, that the fortress was not a thing to be conquered but a thing to be deserved, and that the only way anyone would ever open it was to stop being the conqueror who came to take, and become, instead, the kind of being humanity had been waiting 15,000 years for someone to become. My expedition began to die the way all the others had died, and I have to tell you about the dying, because it is the thing that finally changed me, and because it is the cruelest part of what the fortress was, that it did not need to kill anyone, because conquerors, left at a gate that will not open, kill themselves every time in the same terrible pattern that 15,000 years of wrecks had recorded, and that I now watched unfold among my own people. It started with frustration, the way it always started. We had come to take the great prize, and the great prize would not be taken, and a conqueror who cannot conquer becomes, very quickly, something ugly. My officers, who had been disciplined and united on the approach, began to fray as the weeks at the gate stretched on and the fortress remained shut. They blamed each other for the failure. They blamed me. They proposed wilder and wilder assaults, each one failing as the last had failed, each failure deepening the frustration, until the frustration curdled into something worse, into faction, into suspicion, into the conviction among each group that another group was the reason for our failure, that if only the weak or the cowardly or the incompetent among us were dealt with, the fortress would yield. I had read this pattern in the wrecks. I had seen it written in the abandoned hulks of fleets that had turned their weapons on themselves in the madness of a conquest that would not come. And now I watched it happen to my own expedition, the slow turning inward of a conqueror's force when it meets a thing it cannot conquer, the greed with nowhere to go festering into the destruction of the very people who shared it. And I understood, watching it, the deepest cruelty and the deepest mercy of the fortress, which were the same thing. The fortress did not kill the conquerors who came for it. It simply showed them what they were. Left at a gate that yielded nothing to force, a conqueror has nothing to push against but his own companions, and so the conqueror's nature, the will to take, the readiness for violence, the treating of others as obstacles to be removed, turns inward, and the conqueror destroys himself with the very qualities that made him a conqueror. The fortress was a mirror. It gave you nothing to fight, and so you fought yourself, and the graveyard was 15,000 years of conquerors who had looked into that mirror and been destroyed by what they saw, not because the fortress struck them down, but because the fortress refused to let them be anything other than what they were, and what they were could not survive having nothing to conquer. I could have died that way. I want to be honest about how close I came. As my expedition fractured, as the factions formed and the violence began among my own people, I felt the pull of it, the conqueror's pull, the urge to seize control by force, to crush the factions that opposed me, to take by violence the authority that the failure was stripping from me. I was a conqueror. Violence was my answer, and every instinct I had told me to answer the disintegration of my expedition the way I would answer any obstacle with force. And I stood at the fortress gate, with my expedition tearing itself apart behind me exactly as 15,000 years of expeditions had torn themselves apart, and I felt myself about to become the last entry in the graveyard, the commander who destroyed his own people, and then died at the gate of his own failure, and the fortress would not have lifted a hand to do it, would simply have watched me do it to myself, the way it had watched everyone. And something stopped me. I have thought about what it was in all the years since, and I think it was the wrecks. Because I had studied them, it had been my task, and I knew, as the others did not, that I was about to do the exact thing that 15,000 years of conquerors had done, that my disintegration was not unique or unlucky, but the oldest and most predictable pattern in the graveyard that I was walking, step by step, the path that had ended in every one of those dead ships. And the knowledge gave me a thing that the other conquerors had not had, the ability to see myself from outside, to recognize the pattern I was inside of, to understand that the fortress was not defeating me but revealing me, and that the revelation was a choice. I could be what the graveyard expected, one more conqueror destroyed by his own nature at the gate. Or I could be the thing the fortress was waiting for, which was a conqueror who looked at what conquest was doing to him and chose to stop. I stopped. That is the turn, the whole turn, and it was not dramatic. It was the quietest thing I have ever done. I stopped trying to take the fortress. I called off the assaults. I went among my fracturing expedition, and I did not crush the factions with force, but instead did the thing a conqueror never does, the thing that felt like weakness and was in fact the only strength that could have saved us. I told them the truth. I told them that the fortress could not be taken, that no one had ever taken it, that the graveyard was not the record of a deadly weapon, but of conquerors exactly like us who had destroyed themselves trying to take a thing that yielded nothing to force. I told them that we were about to become another wreck in the cloud, that the pattern was old and we were inside it, and that the only way out was to stop being conquerors, to let go of the prize, to stop trying to take, to choose to leave the gate alive rather than die at it like everyone before us. It was the hardest thing I ever said, because it was the renunciation of everything I was. A conqueror who says, "We cannot take this, let us stop trying to take it," has stopped being a conqueror. And I watched my words land on my expedition, and I watched some of them refuse, the ones too deep in the conqueror's nature to let go, who would rather die at the gate than admit the prize could not be taken. And I watched others, the ones with something left in them beyond the will to conquer, begin to hear it, begin to feel the relief of a burden set down, begin to become, with me, something other than what we had been when we arrived. And the fortress opened. I want to tell you exactly how it happened, because it is the thing that proved everything I had worked out. It did not open when we assaulted it. It did not open when we were strong or united or victorious. It opened in the moment I stopped trying to take it, in the moment I renounced the conquest, told my people the truth, chose to leave the gate alive rather than die taking it, and became, in that choosing, a being who no longer came to seize what lay behind the door. The fortress had been reading us all along, not our weapons, not our strength, but our intent. And the instant my intent changed, the instant I stopped being a conqueror and became simply a being standing at a door with no wish to take what was behind it, the door that 15,000 years of force had never marked simply opened. Silently, easily, the way a door opens for anyone who is not trying to break it down. The fortress had never been locked against strength. It had been locked against greed. And the moment the greed was gone, the moment I stopped wanting to take what was inside and wanted only to stop being the thing that takes, the lock had nothing left to hold against, and it opened because it had only ever been waiting, for 15,000 years, for someone to come to it without the wish to seize it. And I was the first, not because I was stronger than the conquerors in the graveyard, but because I was the first to look at what conquest had made of me and choose, at the very gate, to lay it down. That is where part 2 ends, with the conqueror's renunciation, the expedition's fracture and the choice that stopped it, and the fortress opening at last to the one being in 15,000 years who stopped trying to take it. In part 3, I will tell you what was inside, what humanity had sealed in a fortress that could only be opened by someone who had outgrown conquest, what they had been waiting 15,000 years for the right kind of being to receive. And the last thing the fortress taught me, the conqueror who became its heir, about why humanity built a door that force could never open, and what kind of faith it takes to leave your greatest gift at the edge of the dark, locked behind a test that only the outgrowing of your own worst nature could ever pass. I went in alone. Not because I forbade the others. I forbade nothing now. I was done commanding, done conquering, done being the one who decides who takes what. But because the ones who had refused to stop being conquerors would not enter a fortress they had not conquered, it offended them, the open door, the prize given rather than taken, and they hung back at the threshold in their bitterness. And the ones who had stopped with me, who had laid down the conquest, they understood without my saying it that this first entering was mine to do, because I had been the one to change first, and the change was the key, and a key should turn its own lock. So I went in alone, into the fortress beyond Pluto that 15,000 years of conquerors had died failing to enter, and I will tell you what humanity had sealed inside it, and it was not what any of us, in 15,000 years of greed, had imagined. There was no treasure. I want to say that first, because the treasure was what every conqueror had come for, the hoard worth 15,000 years of deaths, and there was no hoard. There was no weapon either, no superweapon, no secret that would make its possessor invincible, none of the things that conquest dreams of finding behind a door it cannot open. The fortress held none of the things that the conquerors had killed themselves trying to take, and if any of them had ever gotten inside, they would have been bewildered, would have felt cheated, because there was nothing there that greed could want. What was inside was a message and a gift, and they were the same thing, and I have to tell you what they were, because they are the whole meaning of the fortress and the reason humanity built it. The message was waiting in a form I could understand. Humanity had built the fortress to be understood by whoever finally opened it, had encoded its message in a way that would reach across 15,000 years and any species' comprehension. And the message began with an explanation, and the explanation undid me. Humanity, the message said, had built this fortress long ago, in their youth, when they were still becoming what they would become. And they had built it for a specific reason, out of a specific understanding that they had reached the hard way, through their own long and bloody history. That conquest is a phase. That every young civilization goes through it. The will to take, to seize, to expand by force, to treat the universe as a thing to be conquered. And that this phase is the most dangerous time in any civilization's life, the time when it is most likely to destroy itself or others, the fever of a species that has gained power before it has gained the wisdom to hold it. Humanity had survived their own conquest fever, barely, and in surviving it they had learned that it could be outgrown, that a civilization could pass through the will to conquer and come out the other side into something better, into a maturity that no longer needed to take, that could meet the universe in peace rather than in greed. And humanity had built the fortress as a gift to whoever else made it through. That was the thing inside, the gift sealed behind the door that conquest could not open, not treasure but the proof, the message, the welcome, a thing left at the edge of the dark by a people who had outgrown conquest, addressed to the next people who would, sealed behind a lock that only the outgrowing could pick, so that it would reach its intended recipient and no other. The fortress could only be opened by a being who had stopped being a conqueror, and that was not an accident of its defense. That was its entire purpose. Humanity had built a door that would open only to someone who had outgrown conquest, because the thing inside was meant only for such a being, was a message from one people who had made it through to another, and a conqueror could not be allowed to receive it, because a conqueror had not yet earned it, had not yet become the thing the message was addressed to. The message said, "I am giving you its heart, not its every word, because some of it was meant for me alone and I have kept it so," the message said. "If you are reading this, you have done the hardest thing a civilization can do. You have stood at a door that would have given you anything if you could only take it, and you have stopped trying to take it, and in stopping you have proven that you have outgrown the conquest that destroys the young. We built this place to find you, not to defeat the conquerors. We did not care about the conquerors, they defeat themselves, they always have. We built it to find the one who would stop. Because we were lonely in our maturity for others who had made it through, and we could not know, looking out at a galaxy full of conquerors, which of them would someday outgrow it. And so we left this door at the edge of our home, and we filled it not with treasure but with welcome, and we waited. We are waiting still, wherever we have gone, for the first being to arrive who could open it, because that being is our kin, is the proof that we are not alone, is the next member of the only fellowship that matters. The fellowship of those who had the power to conquer and chose to grow instead. And then the message did the thing that broke me and remade me. It welcomed me. By the simple fact of my having opened the door, it knew what I had become, and it welcomed me into the fellowship of the outgrown, me, a conqueror who had come to take and had arrived at the very gate, at the thing humanity had been waiting 15,000 years to give. The knowledge that conquest could be set down, and that setting it down was not a defeat but a graduation, the passage from the dangerous youth of a civilization into the maturity that humanity had reached and left this door to share. I had come to the fortress as the latest in 15,000 years of conquerors. I left it as the first of them to be welcomed, because I was the first to stop, and the stopping was the whole of what humanity had been waiting for. I came out of the fortress changed, and I brought the message to the ones who had stopped with me, and we carried it home, not as a treasure to be hoarded but as a thing to be shared, because that was its nature, the welcome of the outgrown to whoever else would outgrow. And the Kasari Reach, who had sent us out as conquerors to take the great prize, received instead the message of the fortress, and it began among us the slow change that humanity had reached the hard way, the long outgrowing of the conquest fever, the passage toward the maturity that no longer needs to take. Not all at once, not easily. The conqueror's nature does not release a civilization quickly. But the message was a seed, and it was planted, and the Kasari are still beginning, to grow toward the thing humanity had left the fortress to find. A people who had outgrown conquest and could finally be welcomed into the fellowship at the edge of the dark. The graveyard is still there, beyond Pluto, the wrecks of 15,000 years of conquerors. But I see it differently now, and I will tell you how I see it, because it is the last thing the fortress taught me. The graveyard is not a monument to the fortress's invincibility. It is a monument to the long, patient sorrow of a people who left a welcome at the edge of the dark and watched, for 15,000 years, conqueror after conqueror arrive and fail to be the kin they were waiting for, each wreck a being who came so close, who reached the very door, and could not set down the greed that was the only thing between them and the welcome inside. The graveyard is sad, not triumphant. It is 15,000 years of near misses, of beings who had the power to find humanity and lacked the wisdom, who died at the gate of a fellowship they could have joined if they had only been able to stop wanting to take it. And humanity waited through all of it, patient, faithful, certain that someday someone would stop. And someone did finally, and it was me, the conqueror who studied the wrecks and saw himself in them and chose, at the gate, to be the thing the graveyard had never held. A conqueror who stopped. Aliens found a graveyard beyond Pluto, and a fortress that survived 15,000 years of failed conquerors. But the fortress never fought, and the conquerors were never its enemies, and the graveyard was never its victory. The fortress was a door humanity built out of faith, faith that conquest could be outgrown, faith that someday someone would arrive who had outgrown it, faith enough to leave their greatest gift at the edge of the dark and wait 15,000 years for the right kind of being to receive it. The conquerors failed because conquest fails, because greed cannot take a thing that only peace can receive. And the fortress survived not because it was strong, but because it was patient, patient as only a people who have outgrown the need to win can be, waiting at the edge of the dark for the one who would finally stop trying to win and open the door and find, inside, not the treasure they came for, but the welcome they could only receive by ceasing to be the kind of being who comes to take. I went to conquer a fortress. The fortress taught me to stop conquering, and in the stopping, gave me the only thing worth having, the knowledge that the will to take can be set down, and that setting it down is not the end of a civilization but the beginning of its true life, the life humanity reached and left a door to share, and waited 15,000 years with infinite patience and unbroken faith, for someone like me to be ready at last to live.